At the family dinner, I overheard their plan to humiliate me during the Miami Beach trip. That night, my father Jackson called me furious, screaming into the phone, "Where the hell are you?" I answered calmly, "Take a guess, did the family enjoy the gift I left behind?" And when they opened the box, my sister Brielle screamed at the top of her lungs, "Oh my God, what is this?" Before I tell you how I systematically dismantled my toxic family, let me know where you are watching from in the comments below. Hit like and subscribe if you have ever had to cut off toxic relatives to protect your peace. My name is Tessa. I am 32 years old and a senior forensic auditor at a major financial firm in Chicago. I spend my days tracking missing millions, dissecting bank records, and uncovering corporate fraud. I am trained to spot lies in spreadsheets, but my biggest blind spot was always my own family. Growing up, I was the classic scapegoat. My younger sister Brielle, who is now 29, was the undisputed golden child. She spent her days posing for social media, calling herself a successful entrepreneur while contributing absolutely nothing to society. Then she married Connor. Connor is a 33-year-old white man who loudly calls himself an investment broker. In reality, he is a smooth-talking parasite who funds his designer suits and expensive dinners using my parents' money. And by extension, my money. Because in my family, I was the designated bank account. My parents, Jackson and Yvonne, always expected me to foot the bill for their lavish lifestyle while absorbing their endless criticism. Jackson is a proud, stubborn man who cares more about how our family looks to the neighbors than how we actually treat each other. Yvonne is a master manipulator who knows exactly which emotional buttons to push to make me feel guilty. The breaking point happened last Sunday. We were supposed to be finalizing the plans for my parents' 40th wedding anniversary trip to Miami. I had spent all afternoon cooking a massive dinner for them at my house. As I stood at the kitchen sink, washing the heavy ceramic serving dishes, I heard voices drifting in from the outdoor patio. The sliding glass door was cracked open just enough for the cool Chicago evening breeze to carry their conversation right to me. It was Brielle, Connor, and my mother, Yvonne. They were laughing together. It was that deep, mocking, cruel laughter that always made my chest tighten with anxiety. I turned off the water faucet and stood perfectly still in the shadows of the kitchen. Brielle spoke first. Her voice was high-pitched and dripping with absolute malice. She said she could not wait to see the look on my face when Darnell walked into the restaurant in Miami. Hearing that name made the blood drain entirely from my face. Darnell was my highly abusive ex-boyfriend. He was a monster who had drained my bank accounts, isolated me from my friends, and destroyed my self-esteem years ago. I spent 2 solid years in intense therapy just trying to rebuild my mind after escaping him. My mother, Yvonne, actually chuckled in agreement. She told Brielle that I had gotten way too arrogant with my corporate job and my independent lifestyle. Yvonne said Darnell knew exactly how to put me in my place and remind me of where I came from. They were deliberately plotting to ambush me with my abuser on a family vacation I was completely paying for. They wanted to break my spirit in public in front of the whole family, just so they could feel superior. But the betrayal went even deeper than emotional abuse. The conversation on the patio shifted to Connor. I could hear the ice clinking in his whiskey glass as he laughed. He told my mother not to worry about the weekend logistics. Connor casually mentioned that he planned to rent a $50,000 luxury yacht for the anniversary party. Brielle gasped and asked how they were going to afford something so expensive. Connor laughed a deep, arrogant laugh. He said he already had my platinum credit card details saved on his phone from a previous purchase. He planned to put the entire $50,000 deposit on my card the very morning we flew out. He told them I would be too embarrassed and traumatized by Darnell's sudden appearance at the marina to make a scene, so I would just accept the massive charge and pay it off like the obedient bank machine I always was. Yvonne praised him loudly. My own mother called Connor a brilliant and resourceful son-in-law. She said I owed them the money anyway for being such a difficult and stubborn child to raise. I stood frozen in the dark kitchen. For 32 long years, I had craved their love and validation. I thought if I just bought them enough nice things and stayed quiet, they would eventually treat me like real family. But listening to them plot my emotional destruction and financial ruin on my own patio, the last remaining thread of my loyalty snapped completely. Tears of sorrow were instantly replaced by a cold, calculating rage. They forgot who they were dealing with. They forgot that I audit complex financial systems and dismantle frauds for a living. I know how to track every single penny, and I know exactly how to destroy a scammer. I quietly dried my hands on a towel. I picked up a tray of freshly baked desserts and walked out to the dining room, as if absolutely nothing had happened. A moment later, they came inside and sat down at the table. Jackson, my father, immediately started praising Connor. He talked loudly about how successful Connor was and how lucky Brielle was to have a real provider taking care of her. Connor sat there smirking, swirling his expensive red wine, knowing full well he was secretly planning to steal $50,000 from me. Then Yvonne looked at me from across the table. She demanded to know if I had already paid for their first-class flight tickets to Miami. She said Connor needed extra legroom because he was exhausted from his big investment projects. They all stopped eating and stared at me, fully expecting me to submit. I looked at my mother, then at my sister, and finally at Connor. I did not scream. I did not cry. I did not throw the food at them. I simply smiled perfectly and nodded my head. I told them the flights were completely handled. I looked right into Yvonne's eyes and promised her that I had prepared a trip the family would never ever forget. They smiled back at me, completely unaware that they had just activated their own total destruction. That night, after they left, I opened my laptop and began my private audit. I pushed open the swinging door from the kitchen and stepped into the dining room carrying a large glass bowl of warm peach cobbler. The dining room was illuminated by the expensive crystal chandelier that I had paid to have installed just last year. My father Jackson sat at the head of the long mahogany table, holding a glass of scotch and looking like the king of a castle he did not actually own. He was in the middle of telling a loud story about his golf game, but stopped the moment Connor walked in from the patio. My mother Yvonne and my sister Brielle trailed closely behind Connor, looking at him as if he were a celebrity who had graced our home with his presence. I set the dessert on the table and took my seat at the far end, completely ignored by everyone. Jackson immediately directed all his attention to Connor. He leaned forward and asked how the investment firm was doing. Connor unbuttoned his tailored suit jacket and let out a heavy, dramatic sigh. He lied through his teeth, saying the market was brutal right now, but his private clients were seeing massive returns. He talked about moving millions of dollars across overseas accounts and managing high-risk portfolios. It was all a complete fabrication. I knew for a fact that Connor did not have a broker license. I knew he spent his days playing golf and trading cryptocurrency with my parents' retirement money. But Jackson ate up every single word. My father nodded approvingly and said it was a blessing for the family to have a real financial mastermind in the house. He said it took a true man to carry that kind of stress. I sat there quietly, placing a spoonful of cobbler onto my plate. I looked at Brielle, who was busy adjusting her diamond necklace for a selfie. She chimed in, complaining about how stressed she was from managing her lifestyle blog. She said it was exhausting being a public figure and that she desperately needed this Miami vacation to detox her energy. Yvonne reached over and patted Brielle on the hand, telling her how proud she was of her entrepreneurial spirit. Then my mother turned her sharp gaze toward me. The warmth in her eyes instantly vanished, replaced by a familiar coldness. She looked me up and down, analyzing my simple sweater and jeans. Yvonne sighed heavily and asked why I could not put a little more effort into my appearance. She said I was 32 years old and still dressing like a college student studying for finals. She told me that men do not like women who look like they work all the time. She said it was no wonder Darnell left me. Hearing her use my abuser's name as a weapon against me just minutes after I heard her plotting to ambush me with him took every ounce of self-control I possessed. I felt a hot spike of rage in my chest, but I kept my face entirely blank. I took a slow bite of my dessert and told her I was just comfortable in my own home. Jackson scoffed and waved his hand dismissively. He said my job at the auditing firm was making me too rigid and boring. He actually looked at Connor and joked that all I did was push buttons on a calculator while real men like Connor built actual wealth. Connor chuckled and took a sip of his expensive red wine. He looked at me with this sickening pity and said someone had to do the boring paperwork so the real innovators could change the world. They were sitting at a dining table I bought, eating food I paid for in a house I was currently keeping out of foreclosure, and they were calling me a glorified calculator. The conversation then seamlessly shifted to the upcoming Miami trip. Yvonne cleared her throat and adopted a tone she always used when she was about to demand money. She said she had been looking at the flight itineraries I sent them earlier that week. She tilted her head and told me that economy class was simply not going to work for this family. She said Jackson had a bad back and Brielle could not be expected to sit shoulder to shoulder with strangers. Then she brought up Connor. She said Connor was a high-level executive who needed space to take important business calls during the flight. She demanded that I upgrade all 4 of their tickets to first class immediately. She said it was the least I could do since they were gracious enough to invite me along on their anniversary trip. The absolute audacity of her statement hung in the air. I was the one paying for the entire trip, and she was framing it as if they were doing me a massive favor by letting me tag along. Connor added that first class was just standard protocol for him, and he offered to let me put it on my card now, and he would supposedly pay me back when his big real estate deal closed next quarter. It was the same lie he had been telling for 3 years. He never paid anyone back, and he never closed any deals. I looked around the table at the 4 of them. I saw the deep entitlement in my father's posture. I saw the manipulative gleam in my mother's eyes. I saw the smug satisfaction on my sister's face. And I saw the pure, calculated greed radiating from my brother-in-law. The old Tessa would have argued. The old Tessa would have tried to explain my financial budget and begged them to be reasonable. The old Tessa would have eventually cried and given in just to keep the peace. But the woman sitting at that table was not the old Tessa anymore. I thought about the $50,000 yacht charge they were planning to steal from me. I thought about the horrifying ambush they were planning with Darnell. I swallowed the last bite of my cobbler and placed my spoon down gently on the napkin. I looked right into Yvonne's eyes and smiled a bright, perfect smile. I told her she was absolutely right. I said the family deserved nothing but the absolute best for such a momentous occasion. I promised her I would handle the first-class upgrades tonight. I kept smiling as I looked at each of them, and I told them I was preparing a trip that this family would never, ever forget. They beamed with satisfaction, completely oblivious to the double meaning of my words. They finished their desserts, left their dirty, sticky dishes on my table, and walked out the front door without a single word of thanks. The moment the heavy front door clicked shut behind them, the fake smile dropped from my face. I walked straight past the messy dining room to my home office and locked the door behind me. I sat down at my glass desk and opened my laptop. The dinner table gaslighting was finally over. It was time for the forensic audit to begin. The glow of my laptop screen illuminated my dark home office as I pulled up the financial tracking software I used for high-level corporate investigations. For years, I had managed my parents' basic accounts, paying their utility bills and property taxes, so I already had their primary banking routing numbers. That was the fatal mistake Connor made. He assumed I was just a glorified secretary who wrote checks. He had no idea that with just a single routing number, I could unravel his entire financial existence in a matter of hours. My fingers flew across the keyboard. The silence of the room was only broken by the rapid clicking of keys and the hum of the computer processor. I started with my father Jackson and his retirement accounts. He had worked his entire life to build a comfortable nest egg, and he guarded it jealously from everyone except his favorite son-in-law. I pulled the digital statements from the last 3 years and immediately noticed a massive bleeding of funds. Hundreds of thousands of dollars had been transferred out in large, uneven chunks. The destination for every single transfer was a limited liability company registered in Delaware under the name Apex Global Investments. I ran a quick corporate registry search on Apex Global. The registered agent was Connor. A cold smile crept across my face as I dug deeper into Apex Global. I bypassed the standard banking walls using forensic backdoors to trace where the money went after it hit Connor's account. It was not going into real estate. It was not going into the stock market. The money was flowing directly out to pay off expensive car leases, luxury hotel stays, and massive credit card bills for him and Brielle. But then I saw the pattern. Every time a new victim wired money into Apex Global, Connor would immediately take a portion of that new money to pay a small return to an older investor. It was a textbook Ponzi scheme. He was robbing Peter to pay Paul. And my father was his biggest, completely oblivious cash cow. Connor was entirely broke, living on stolen time and stolen money, pretending to be a Wall Street genius. But what I found next made my blood run truly cold. I accessed the county property tax records for my parents' sprawling brick mansion in Chicago. I expected to see the standard property tax history, but a glaring red flag flashed on my screen indicating a recent lien on the property. I pulled up the full deed and mortgage history. 6 months ago, a massive second mortgage had been taken out against the house for $400,000. I pulled the digital signature page. My parents' signatures were at the bottom, but the notary stamp belonged to one of Connor's shady friends. Connor had convinced my father to leverage the entire equity of the family home to fund his fake investment firm. My dad loved keeping up appearances so much that he literally signed away the roof over his head just to brag about his wealthy son-in-law at the country club. My parents were completely underwater. Worse than that, the second mortgage had not been paid in 4 months. The bank had already issued a pre-foreclosure notice that had been mailed to a post office box controlled by Connor. My parents had absolutely no idea they were weeks away from being violently evicted from their beloved mansion. Connor had stolen their life savings, mortgaged their house, and was now planning to charge $50,000 to my credit card before fleeing the inevitable fallout. They thought they were going to Miami to celebrate their anniversary and destroy my mental health. They did not realize they were actually walking into a financial slaughterhouse. I glanced at the digital clock on my glass desk. It was 1 in the morning, but I did not care. Adrenaline was pumping through my veins. I picked up my phone and dialed the personal number of my private attorney, Julian. Julian was a ruthless corporate lawyer who specialized in aggressive debt acquisitions, and he was worth every penny of his exorbitant hourly rate. He answered on the second ring, knowing I would only call at this ungodly hour if I had a kill shot lined up and ready to fire. I told Julian I needed him to contact the private lending group that held the second mortgage on my parents' house. I instructed him to negotiate an immediate buyout of the defaulted debt. I had the liquid capital ready to go from my company stock options and a very healthy savings account. I told Julian I wanted to purchase the debt completely in my name and take over the foreclosure process immediately. Julian chuckled softly through the phone and asked if I was absolutely sure I wanted to play it this aggressively with my own flesh and blood. I looked at the yacht rental contract Connor had saved in his browser history, waiting to hit my platinum card. I thought about the sheer cruelty in my mother's voice when she laughed about using my violent abuser to break my spirit on a trip I was funding. I told Julian I had never been more sure of anything in my entire life. I wanted the paperwork expedited and finalized before their flight to Miami on Friday. I wanted total legal ownership of that house locked in and filed with the county. I hung up the phone and leaned back in my ergonomic chair. The first major domino had been officially pushed. Connor thought he was a mastermind, but he left a digital financial trail a mile wide. My parents thought their golden son-in-law was making them rich while they happily plotted to feed me to the wolves. They were all about to learn a very painful lesson in forensic accounting. Over the next 3 days, I played my role perfectly. I was the obedient scapegoat daughter, completely submissive and helpful. Brielle texted me constantly demanding that I book them the most expensive penthouse suite at the Miami resort and secure a luxury sports car for Connor to drive around South Beach so he could look important. I cheerfully replied to every text confirming all her ridiculous requests, but I did not use my own money to secure the reservations. I used the corporate credit cards linked to Connor's fake company, Apex Global. I knew those cards were entirely maxed out and flagged, but I overrode the initial limits using a temporary hold loophole that hotels often use for deposits. It was a perfect legal trap. The moment the hotel and rental agencies tried to process the actual final charges upon their arrival, those cards would trigger massive fraud alerts. I calmly packed a small overnight bag, not for the bright beaches of Miami, but for a local luxury hotel right down the street in downtown Chicago. I had absolutely no intention of ever getting on that airplane. My toxic family spent the rest of the week gloating, gossiping, and packing their designer luggage, completely blind to the legal and financial guillotine hanging directly over their necks. The days leading up to the trip were a masterclass in bottomless family greed. It started on Tuesday morning while I was sitting in my office reviewing the final foreclosure documents for my parents' house. My phone vibrated on the glass desk. It was a text message from Brielle. She did not bother saying good morning or asking how I was doing. She simply sent a link to the website of the Miami resort we were supposed to be staying at. She followed it up with a long paragraph complaining about the accommodations. She said she had been looking at the room layout for the standard luxury suite I had booked, and it was simply unacceptable. She claimed the lighting was bad for her Instagram photos, and the balcony was too small for her morning yoga routine. She demanded that I call the resort immediately and upgrade them to the presidential penthouse suite. She said Connor deserved a premium space to relax after working so hard to provide for the family. She reminded me that I owed them this much since I was single and had no real financial responsibilities of my own. A few minutes later, my mother Yvonne chimed in on the family group chat to support Brielle. Yvonne told me to stop being so cheap and just pay the difference. She said it was their 40th anniversary, and I was ruining the mood by forcing them to stay in a regular room like common tourists. She said if I really loved them, I would want them to experience true luxury. The sheer audacity would have broken the old me. The old me would have cried in the office bathroom feeling unloved and inadequate. But the new me just smiled at the glowing screen of my phone. I replied to the group chat and told them they were absolutely right. I apologized for my lack of foresight and promised to secure the penthouse immediately. I opened a secure browser on my computer and navigated to the resort website. The presidential penthouse cost $8,000 a night. For a 4-night stay, that was $32,000 just for the room. I proceeded to the payment page, but I did not type in my own credit card number. Instead, I pulled up the digital file I had extracted from Connor's fake investment firm Apex Global. I selected a corporate credit card that was tied directly to the fraudulent accounts he used to launder money from his Ponzi scheme. I knew exactly how luxury resort billing systems worked. When you book a room, they do not immediately charge the full amount. They place a temporary authorization hold on the card to ensure the funds are there. The actual hard charge only processes when the guest physically checks in at the front desk and hands over their identification. Because I had previously used my corporate bypass methods to artificially inflate the authorization limits on Connor's shell accounts, the temporary hold went through perfectly. I took a screenshot of the confirmed penthouse reservation and sent it to the family group chat. My phone instantly lit up with messages from Brielle, sending party emojis and calling me the best sister ever. They were so easily manipulated by shiny things, but their greed did not stop there. On Wednesday afternoon, Brielle texted me again. This time she said Connor had a serious problem. She explained that Connor had set up several impromptu meetings with high-net-worth real estate developers in South Beach during the trip. She said he could not possibly show up to these million-dollar meetings in a standard rental car or an Uber. She said it would completely destroy his professional image and humiliate the family. She demanded that I rent him an exotic sports car for the weekend. Specifically, he wanted a bright yellow Lamborghini Huracan. She told me to just put it on my card, and Connor would write me a check when we got back to Chicago. It was the exact same lie he always used to steal from me. I did not argue. I did not ask questions. I simply replied saying I would handle it. I found a high-end exotic car rental agency in Miami that catered to wealthy tourists. The rental cost for the Lamborghini was $2,500 a day, plus a massive $10,000 security deposit. Once again, I bypassed my own bank accounts and used another one of Connor's fraudulent corporate cards from Apex Global. The agency placed the authorization hold for $20,000. It was approved. I sent the confirmation number to Brielle. She replied saying Connor was thrilled and that my father Jackson was bragging to all his friends at the country club about how successful his son-in-law was. They were so blinded by their own arrogance that they could not see the massive legal trap closing around them. By demanding these extravagant upgrades, they were forcing me to use Connor's stolen funds across state lines. In the eyes of the federal government, moving fraudulent funds from Illinois to Florida to purchase luxury goods is the textbook definition of wire fraud. Every single time Brielle demanded a new upgrade, she was adding another federal charge to her husband's inevitable indictment. I was not just booking a vacation for them. I was meticulously building an airtight criminal case for the FBI. By Thursday evening, the trap was fully set. I had authorized over $50,000 in luxury accommodations and exotic car rentals, using stolen money tied directly to Connor's name. And that did not even include the $50,000 yacht deposit he was planning to steal from my personal card the next morning. My parents and my sister spent their Thursday night packing their expensive luggage and drinking champagne at their house. They were celebrating their impending victory over my self-esteem. They were laughing about how they were going to feed me to my abusive ex-boyfriend Darnell the moment we landed in Florida. Meanwhile, I sat alone in my dark apartment methodically organizing my digital evidence files. I compiled the bank records, the property deeds, the forged notary stamps, and the wire fraud transaction receipts into a single encrypted folder. I felt a profound sense of peace wash over me. I was completely detached from them emotionally. They were no longer my mother, my father, my sister, or my brother-in-law. They were simply targets in a forensic audit. And the audit was about to conclude. Tomorrow morning they would board a plane to paradise, expecting to ruin my life. But they had no idea they were flying straight into a nightmare they would never wake up from. It was barely 10 o'clock on Thursday night when my phone buzzed on the kitchen counter. I was just finishing a glass of water before heading to bed. I glanced at the glowing screen and saw a text message from a number I had blocked years ago, but had somehow managed to bypass my digital filters using a spoofed caller ID. The preview of the text made my breath catch in my throat for just a fraction of a second. It was from Darnell. The message was exactly as vile and arrogant as the man himself. He said he heard I was still single and acting like I was too good for everyone. He actually thanked my mother Yvonne for the special invitation to join them in Miami. He typed out a long, rambling paragraph telling me that my corporate job and my independent attitude were just a pathetic cry for help. He said he could not wait to see me this weekend so he could finally teach me how to be a real obedient wife. He ended the text by saying he would be waiting at the luxury steakhouse at 8 o'clock on Friday night and that I better wear something nice for him. 5 years ago, a text message like that from Darnell would have sent me into a full-blown panic attack. I would have locked my doors, closed my blinds, and cried on the bathroom floor, feeling completely powerless. He was a master at psychological warfare and physical intimidation. My family knew exactly how much he had destroyed me, and they intentionally weaponized him just to break my spirit. But as I stood in the quiet calm of my apartment, I did not feel any fear. I only felt a cold, calculated determination to bury him alongside the rest of them. I took my water glass to the sink and walked calmly back to my home office. I sat down at my glass desk and opened a new encrypted search window on my laptop. Darnell thought he was untouchable. He thought he could just waltz into a 5-star restaurant in South Beach, act like a wealthy alpha male, and humiliate me in public. But Darnell was not very smart. He was a grifter who survived by manipulating vulnerable women. And like all lazy grifters, he left a massive digital paper trail everywhere he went. I ran his full legal name and his date of birth through a premium background check database that my firm used to vet corporate executives. It took less than 90 seconds for his entire pathetic life to load onto my screen. Darnell did not have a real job. He had been evicted from 2 different apartments in the last 18 months, and his credit score was virtually non-existent. He had a history of petty theft and public intoxication. But the most interesting part of his digital file was the glaring red flag under the active criminal records section. Darnell had 3 active felony arrest warrants out of the state of Florida. I clicked on the associated court documents and started reading through the public filings. Darnell had fathered 3 children with 3 different women across the greater Miami-Dade County area over the past 6 years. He had completely abandoned all of them shortly after they were born. The Florida Department of Revenue had been hunting him down for years for felony evasion of child support. I pulled up the financial ledgers attached to the warrants. He owed a staggering $85,000 in back payments across the 3 different cases. The court records showed multiple bench warrants issued by family court judges demanding his immediate arrest the moment he stepped foot in the state. He had been dodging the local police by living out of state and working sketchy under-the-table cash jobs. But his massive ego and his desperate desire to team up with my mother just to humiliate me had just lured him right back into the exact legal jurisdiction where he was actively wanted by the law. A genuine smile touched my lips as I read through the details. It was almost too easy. My mother and my sister thought they had orchestrated the perfect psychological ambush to put me in my place. They had absolutely no idea they had just invited an active fugitive to sit down at their expensive anniversary dinner. I decided right then and there that it was my civic duty to help the Florida authorities apprehend a man who was actively avoiding taking care of his own innocent children. I opened a secure encrypted email client that routed my internet connection through an untraceable virtual private network. I could not risk Darnell or my family tracing the digital tip back to my personal computer. I spent a few minutes searching the local government websites until I found the direct contact information for the Fugitive Warrants Division of the Miami Police Department. I drafted a highly detailed anonymous tip for the detectives. I included his full legal name, his exact date of birth, his social security number, and the specific docket numbers for all 3 of his active felony warrants. I attached a recent clear photograph of him that I easily pulled from his public social media profile, where he was bragging about his upcoming trip to South Beach. But the most important detail I provided was his exact location and itinerary for Friday night. Thanks to his own arrogant and threatening text message, I knew exactly where he was going to be waiting for me. I typed out the name of the luxury steakhouse in South Beach where my family was planning to host their massive anniversary dinner. I included the street address and the exact reservation time. I noted that the large party reservation was likely booked under the name of my brother-in-law, Connor, or my father, Jackson. I politely informed the police department that a dangerous fugitive with a history of violence and multiple active felony warrants would be sitting at that specific table at exactly 8:00 tomorrow evening, dressed in fine clothes and expecting a celebration. I reviewed the email one last time to make sure there was absolutely nothing that could identify me as the anonymous sender. The details were airtight, and the public court evidence was undeniable. I clicked send and watched the green confirmation message flash across my screen, indicating the message had been successfully delivered to the police dispatch. The trap for Darnell was officially armed and fully operational. He wanted to show up to a fancy dinner to play the role of the dominant alpha male and teach me how to be a submissive, abused wife again. Instead, he was going to be met by a squad of armed officers and a pair of cold steel handcuffs right in the middle of his expensive appetizer. I closed the laptop and pushed my chair back from the glass desk. My family wanted to bring my worst nightmare to life in Miami just to watch me suffer. I had simply arranged for a local police escort to join their little party. I turned off the lights in my home office and walked quietly to my bedroom. For the first time in over 5 years, I went to sleep thinking about Darnell and I did not have a single nightmare or a moment of panic. I slipped under my warm blankets and slept deeply and peacefully, knowing that by tomorrow night, the ghosts of my past and the toxic abusers of my present would all violently collide in a spectacular explosion of their own making. Friday morning arrived with a crisp breeze blowing off Lake Michigan. My alarm went off at 6 a.m., but I was already awake sitting at my kitchen island with a mug of dark roast coffee and watching the digital tracking app on my phone screen. I had quietly slipped a tiny Apple AirTag deep into the lining of my mother's oversized Louis Vuitton tote bag earlier in the week just to make absolutely sure I knew their exact movements on travel day. The glowing blue dot on my map showed that their luxury private car service, which I had naturally paid for, was currently pulling into the terminal at Chicago O'Hare International Airport. I could perfectly picture the obnoxious scene they were causing at the curb. Brielle would be wearing oversized designer sunglasses inside the terminal, complaining about the fluorescent lighting while dragging a matching set of pristine monogrammed luggage that she forced me to buy her for Christmas. Connor would be barking aggressive orders at the skycap porters, acting like a seasoned Wall Street billionaire while handing out a meager $5 tip. My father Jackson would be walking with his chest puffed out, wearing his favorite tailored golf polo, acting like he owned the entire airport concourse. And Yvonne would be trailing behind them, judging everyone waiting in the economy check-in line, muttering about how tragic poor people looked when they traveled. I waited patiently until the tracking dot showed they had cleared the private security screening designated for first-class passengers and were safely seated in the exclusive airline departure lounge. I gave them exactly 10 minutes to settle in and order their first round of pre-flight mimosas. Then I picked up my phone and dialed my mother's number. She answered on the third ring with a heavy sigh, sounding like picking up the phone was a massive physical burden. I immediately launched into my carefully rehearsed performance. I made my voice sound frantic and panicked, breathing heavily into the receiver. I told Yvonne there was an absolute disaster at the accounting firm. I lied and said a major corporate client was undergoing a surprise audit by the federal government, and my managing director had locked down our entire department to seize hard drives and review ledgers. I told her I was stuck at the downtown office and there was absolutely no way I could make the morning flight to Miami. I expected at least a tiny bit of fake sympathy or maternal concern, but I did not even get that. Yvonne let out a loud, dramatic groan of pure annoyance. She did not ask if I was okay or if my highly lucrative job was in any kind of jeopardy. She simply complained that my absence was going to completely ruin the aesthetic of the family arrival photos she wanted to post on Facebook to make her friends jealous. I could hear my father Jackson in the background yelling loudly enough for the whole lounge to hear that I always put my stupid calculator job ahead of family loyalty. Brielle snatched the phone directly from my mother and told me I was being incredibly selfish and inconsiderate. She said they were going to Miami to celebrate real love and family unity, and I was just bringing my bitter single-woman energy to ruin their high vibrations. She actually told me not to bother coming at all if I was going to show up in a bad mood and ruin her social media content. Then Connor leaned into the microphone. I could hear the smug, arrogant grin in his voice. He told me to just stay at the office and crunch my little numbers because the real adults were going to handle the luxury vacation. He said it was probably for the best anyway, since my presence would just remind everyone of Darnell and bring the whole mood down. Hearing him mention my abuser casually as a joke sent a sharp thrill of anticipation through my veins. I swallowed my laughter and forced a pathetic, shaking apology into the phone. I promised them I would catch a later red-eye flight and meet them directly at the steakhouse for the anniversary dinner that night. Brielle rolled her eyes so hard I could practically hear it over the cellular connection. She told me to just make sure my platinum credit card was active and unrestricted for the yacht rental because Connor needed to secure the $50,000 deposit the exact moment they landed in Florida. I assured her the card was completely ready and waiting for them to use. With a dismissive click, she hung up on me without even saying goodbye or wishing me luck with my fake work emergency. I opened the airline application on my laptop and watched their boarding status update in real time. I had booked their expensive first-class tickets using my massive reserve of corporate travel reward points that I had accumulated over years of grueling business trips. They thought they were flying in absolute luxury because Connor was a high roller providing for the family, but they were literally sitting in seats earned by the very career they had just spent 10 minutes loudly insulting. I imagined them settling into their plush leather reclining pods, drinking complimentary champagne, and posting arrogant selfies bragging about their blessed and wealthy lives. I watched the digital flight status change from boarding to taxiing. They were now locked in a sealed metal tube 30,000 feet in the air, with their phones forced into airplane mode for the next 3.5 hours. They were completely unreachable, entirely cut off from the outside world, and totally blind to the massive legal hurricane heading straight for them. The game was officially on. The moment the airline app showed the wheels of their plane had left the Chicago runway, I closed out of the flight tracker and opened my encrypted banking portal. It was time to pull the rug out from under their perfect first-class lives, and the first step was cutting off their financial oxygen supply. The digital clock on my laptop read exactly 9:45 a.m. I watched the tiny airplane icon on the flight tracker application move steadily eastward away from the Illinois border. They were officially airborne and entirely incommunicado. I took a long, slow sip of my coffee, letting the dark roast ground me before I initiated the total financial lockdown. I opened a new browser window and logged into the administrative portal for my primary platinum credit card. This was the exact account Connor had saved on his phone, the one he planned to use to authorize a massive $50,000 luxury yacht deposit upon his arrival in Florida. I did not just lower the limit or put a temporary freeze on the account. I permanently canceled the card, reporting it as completely compromised due to suspected unauthorized fraudulent activity. Then I moved to the supplementary accounts. Over the years, Yvonne and Jackson had guilted me into making them authorized users on 3 of my other credit lines, claiming it was just for household emergencies. I pulled up the digital ledgers. Their version of an emergency apparently included weekly trips to high-end day spas, expensive golf clubs, and premium cable packages. With 3 simple clicks, I severed their access to every single one of my accounts. I locked my savings, I froze my checking, and I transferred my emergency liquid capital into a secure, untouchable trust fund managed by my attorney. In less than 5 minutes, my toxic family had gone from pretending to be wealthy jet-setters to having absolutely zero access to my money. They were flying through the clouds completely broke and entirely oblivious. But freezing the cards was just the prologue. The main event was waiting for me downtown. I dressed quickly, putting on a sharp, tailored navy blue suit that I usually reserved for high-stakes corporate board meetings. I pulled my hair into a tight professional bun and grabbed my leather briefcase containing the final certified checks. The drive to the downtown financial district was smooth. I parked my car and walked confidently into the massive glass and steel skyscraper that housed the private lending firm that held the second mortgage on my parents' mansion. My attorney Julian was already waiting for me in the lobby, looking entirely too pleased with himself. We were escorted up to the 42nd floor into a sleek, modern conference room overlooking Lake Michigan. A senior loan officer was sitting at the long mahogany table, sliding a thick stack of legal documents toward us. The process of buying out defaulted debt is usually messy and drawn out, but when you show up with a highly aggressive corporate lawyer and a massive cashier check covering the full principal plus penalties, the red tape disappears almost instantly. The lending firm was thrilled to offload a toxic non-performing loan from their books without having to go through the lengthy and expensive eviction process themselves. I sat at the table carefully reading over every single line of the final transfer agreements. Connor had been incredibly sloppy. The fraudulent notary stamp he used was glaringly obvious to anyone trained to look for it. He had literally signed away my parents' financial security just to keep his fake Ponzi scheme afloat for a few more months. I picked up the heavy black fountain pen Julian offered me. I pressed the metal nib to the thick paper and signed my name on the final line of the debt transfer agreement. I handed over the certified check, and the loan officer stamped the file closed. Julian gave me a quick professional nod. It was officially done. The moment the ink dried on those pages, I became the sole legal owner of the massive brick mansion my parents prized above all else. The very house where they had belittled me, dismissed me, and plotted my emotional ruin was now legally mine. They were no longer homeowners. They were simply tenants who were severely behind on rent, and their new landlord was not going to be offering any extensions. I left the skyscraper feeling an incredible surge of power vibrating through my chest. The heavy, invisible chains of guilt and obligation that had choked me for 32 years were finally completely broken. But I still had one more critical errand to run before my family landed in Miami. I drove my car directly from the downtown financial district to my parents' sprawling suburban neighborhood. The streets were quiet, lined with perfectly manicured lawns and towering oak trees. I pulled into the wide, circular driveway of the massive brick colonial house. It looked exactly the same as it had on Sunday night, when I stood in the kitchen and listened to them laugh about destroying me. But the energy had fundamentally shifted. It was no longer a fortress of their arrogance. It was simply an asset in my portfolio. I had arranged for a commercial locksmith to meet me at the property at exactly noon. A white utility van was already idling at the curb when I arrived. Two men in uniform work shirts stepped out carrying heavy metal toolboxes. I walked up the front steps, pulled out my copy of the old house key, and unlocked the heavy oak door for the final time. I instructed the locksmiths to completely remove and replace every single exterior lock on the property. The front door, the back patio sliding doors, the side garage entrance, and even the heavy iron gates leading to the backyard pool area. I wanted high-security deadbolts installed on every access point. I stood in the grand foyer and watched as the men systematically dismantled the old brass locks. The metallic grinding and drilling echoed loudly through the empty house, sounding like the most beautiful symphony I had ever heard. I walked slowly through the rooms, trailing my hand over the expensive antique furniture and looking at the framed family photographs lining the hallway. Every picture featured Brielle smiling brightly, surrounded by my beaming parents. I was either pushed to the far edge of the frame or missing entirely. They had spent their whole lives actively trying to erase me from this family. I was simply returning the favor by erasing their access to my property. It took the locksmiths just under 2 hours to complete the job. I paid them in cash from my briefcase and thanked them for their fast work. They handed me a heavy ring of shiny new silver keys. I locked the brand new heavy deadbolt on the front door and tested the handle. It was completely solid and unyielding. The house was completely secured. I walked back to my car, sat in the driver's seat, and placed the new keys in my cup holder. I pulled up the flight tracking application on my phone one more time. The little airplane icon was just beginning its initial descent into Miami International Airport. They were about 30 minutes away from landing. I leaned my head back against the leather headrest and smiled. The trap was fully armed, the exits were securely locked, and the financial floor was about to violently drop out from under them. The flight landed right on schedule under the glaring Florida sun. I tracked their progress from my laptop in Chicago, watching as their location dot moved from the airport terminal to a luxury SUV transport service they had prearranged. The vehicle drove them across the causeway straight toward the exclusive oceanfront resort in South Beach. I could easily visualize the grand entrance they were making. Brielle was undoubtedly holding her phone high in the air, recording the towering palm trees and the sparkling ocean waves for her followers, pretending she owned the city. Jackson and Yvonne were likely strutting through the marble lobby, looking down their noses at the regular tourists, while Connor approached the front desk with the swagger of a billionaire ready to claim his presidential penthouse. I had placed a discreet call to the resort manager earlier that morning, posing as a concerned corporate compliance officer. I quietly advised them that the credit cards on file for Connor's reservation were currently under federal investigation for wire fraud, and that any attempt to process them would trigger an immediate security alert. The front desk staff was fully prepared for their arrival. When Connor stepped up to the polished mahogany counter, he casually tossed his ID and the Apex Global corporate card across the marble surface. He loudly demanded the keys to the penthouse and asked the concierge to bring the bright yellow Lamborghini around to the front drive. The well-dressed desk agent maintained a perfectly polite customer service smile as he swiped the card through the terminal. The machine beeped a sharp, harsh tone. The screen flashed bright red with a severe fraud alert code. The agent quietly informed Connor that the card was declined and asked if he had another form of payment. Connor laughed arrogantly, acting like it was just a silly banking error for someone who spent as much money as he did. He reached into his designer wallet and pulled out a second Apex Global card. The agent swiped it. Another sharp beep. Another hard decline. Connor's smug smile began to falter. He started getting aggressive, leaning over the counter and raising his voice. He demanded that the agent run the cards again, claiming his investment firm had millions of dollars in liquid assets. The desk agent stopped typing and looked Connor directly in the eye. Speaking in a voice just loud enough for the crowded lobby to hear, the agent stated that the accounts were locked due to suspected corporate fraud and that the terminal was instructing the hotel to seize the physical cards immediately. The atmosphere in the luxury lobby instantly changed. Wealthy guests in designer resort wear stopped sipping their welcome drinks and turned to stare at the commotion. Brielle abruptly stopped recording her video as the reality of the situation began to set in. Jackson stepped in, chest puffed out, trying to use his booming patriarch voice to bully the staff. He told the agent they were making a massive mistake and pulled out his own credit card to cover the balance. The card that was linked directly to my account. The card I had completely frozen 2 hours ago. The agent swiped Jackson's card. Declined. Yvonne pushed her way to the front, panicking, and handed over her card. Declined. The humiliation was absolute and instantaneous. The entire family was standing in the middle of a 5-star resort lobby, surrounded by towering floral arrangements and crystal chandeliers, with their cards being violently rejected one after another. The front desk manager finally stepped in, flanked by 2 large men in dark suits from hotel security. The manager politely but firmly informed them that since they could not provide a valid form of payment for the $32,000 room or the luxury car rental, they would need to vacate the premises immediately. Jackson's face turned a dangerous shade of crimson. Yvonne began frantically dialing my phone number over and over again, but my phone remained completely silent on my kitchen counter. They were aggressively escorted out of the air-conditioned marble lobby and pushed back out into the sweltering Miami heat. They stood on the sidewalk surrounded by their matching designer luggage as the luxury SUV that brought them there drove away. The illusion of their wealth completely evaporated in the Florida humidity. Connor frantically checked his personal banking app, only to realize his remaining accounts were heavily overdrawn. Jackson and Yvonne desperately emptied their wallets, counting the physical cash they had brought for tipping. Between the 4 of them, they barely scraped together $300 in crumpled bills. It was not enough to get back on a plane. It was not even enough for one night at a decent mid-tier hotel. They had to drag their heavy, expensive bags down the pristine sidewalk until they found a regular yellow taxi willing to take them off the expensive beach and into the gritty industrial outskirts of the city. They ended up at a dilapidated single-story roadside motel, backed up against a noisy highway. The neon sign out front was buzzing and missing half its letters. Connor paid the gruff attendant in cash through bulletproof glass for a single cramped room with 2 hard double beds. When they opened the flimsy wooden door, the smell of stale cigarette smoke and bleach hit them like a physical blow. The carpet was stained, and the air conditioner rattled violently in the window. The moment Brielle stepped into the dimly lit room, she saw a large brown cockroach scurry across the cracked bathroom tile. She dropped her expensive leather bag on the dirty floor and completely shattered. She fell to her knees and began sobbing hysterically. It was not just a few tears, it was a full-blown earth-shattering meltdown. She wailed about how her aesthetic was completely ruined and how she had already promised her thousands of followers a massive luxury penthouse room tour. She had absolutely no content to post. Her entire fake identity was tied to portraying a wealthy lifestyle she did not actually own. She screamed at Connor, asking him how he could let this happen. She screamed at my parents, blaming them for raising a sister who was so useless she could not even keep a credit card active. She sat on the filthy motel floor crying over her Instagram feed, while the rest of the family stared at each other in stunned, horrifying silence. The beautiful Miami anniversary trip had officially turned into a squalid, suffocating prison. Yvonne sat on the edge of the lumpy mattress, staring blankly at the stained wallpaper. For the first time in her life, she had absolutely no one to manipulate, and no one to foot the bill. Jackson paced the short distance between the door and the window, his pride completely shattered. He kept muttering that there had to be a mistake, that I must have forgotten to pay the credit card bills like the irresponsible daughter he always claimed I was. But deep down, the realization was beginning to seep into their bones. They were trapped miles away from home with no money, no resources, and no scapegoat to absorb their misery. They were finally forced to sit in the exact filth and toxicity they had created. The stifling heat of the motel room felt like a physical weight, pressing down on their chests as the reality of their situation sank in. But my father Jackson was a man completely driven by his own massive ego and a desperate need to maintain appearances. He paced the stained carpet of the cramped room, refusing to accept that he had been bested. He stopped pacing and turned to the family with a look of frantic determination. He told them they were not going to sit in this filthy room and cry like peasants. He reminded them that Darnell was expecting them at the exclusive South Beach Steakhouse at 8 o'clock, and they were going to be there. Jackson still firmly believed my earlier lie about catching a later flight. He was convinced that if they could just hold the table and keep Darnell entertained until I arrived, they could force me to hand over my credit card to pay for the expensive dinner and rescue them from this nightmare. Yvonne looked at him like he had lost his mind. She pointed out that they barely had $300 in crumpled cash to their names, which was barely enough to cover the cost of a single appetizer at a place like that. But Jackson waved off her concerns. He ordered everyone to wash up in the rusty motel sink and put on their best designer evening wear. He said they would simply order tap water and stall until I walked through the doors. Connor tried to argue, saying it was too risky, but Jackson barked at him, telling him to shut up and act like the wealthy broker he pretended to be. The dynamic had completely shifted. Connor was no longer the golden son-in-law, he was just another broke liability. They spent the next hour getting ready in absolute miserable silence. Brielle tried to fix her makeup in a cracked mirror, crying softly because the humidity was ruining her expensive blowout. They walked out to the busy highway and hailed a cheap rideshare car using the last few dollars in Yvonne's digital wallet account. The ride to South Beach was agonizingly tense. They sat shoulder to shoulder in the back of a smelling sedan, a stark contrast to the luxury SUV they had arrived in just hours earlier. When they finally pulled up to the gleaming glass facade of the steakhouse, they had to paste on fake smiles and pretend they belonged there. The hostess led them to a massive circular booth right in the center of the elegant dining room. The restaurant was dimly lit with crystal chandeliers and loud with the chatter of actually wealthy people. A waiter in a crisp white tuxedo approached the table, immediately offering them a leather-bound wine list that featured bottles costing more than their entire combined bank accounts. Jackson cleared his throat nervously and handed the list back. He told the waiter they were waiting for a very important guest and would just start with some tap water for the table. The waiter gave them a slightly judgmental nod and walked away. They sat there in the luxurious booth, completely terrified, sweating in their expensive clothes, knowing they were sitting on a financial time bomb. At exactly 8:15, the heavy glass doors of the restaurant swung open and Darnell walked in. He was wearing a flashy silk shirt, unbuttoned dangerously low, and a heavy gold chain that looked incredibly fake under the expensive restaurant lighting. He swaggered past the hostess stand, acting like he owned the entire city. Jackson stood up and forced a massive welcoming smile, waving Darnell over to the table. Darnell approached with a cocky grin, expecting to see me sitting there completely broken and ready to submit to his abuse. He slid into the booth next to Brielle, sliding his arm across the back of the leather seat. He looked around the table, his smile slowly fading when he realized there was an empty seat. He looked directly at Jackson and asked where his girl was. Jackson swallowed hard, his confident patriarch facade cracking at the edges. He stammered out a weak excuse, saying I had a sudden work emergency but was on a later flight and would be arriving any minute. Darnell narrowed his eyes, leaning forward across the table. He was a predator, and he could immediately smell fear and desperation. He looked at the 4 glasses of tap water sitting in the middle of the empty table and let out a harsh, mocking laugh. Darnell did not bother keeping his voice down. He asked Jackson if he was seriously trying to play games with him. He looked at Connor and openly mocked his wrinkled suit, asking if the big-time Wall Street broker was going through a rough quarter. Connor stared down at his empty hands, too terrified and broke to defend himself. Then Darnell turned his attention to Brielle. He laughed in her face and told her she looked like a cheap reality television extra desperately trying to look rich. Brielle gasped, her eyes filling with fresh tears, but she was completely powerless to stop him. Yvonne tried to intervene, putting on her best manipulative mother voice. She reached across the table and told Darnell he was being incredibly rude to the people who had graciously invited him to this exclusive dinner. Darnell swatted her hand away without even looking at her. He told her to save the fake mother routine for someone stupid enough to believe it. He said he knew exactly how much they hated me, and that was the only reason he even agreed to show up. He wanted to see me squirm, but watching them squirm was turning out to be almost as entertaining. Darnell leaned back in the booth and crossed his arms. He told Jackson he knew exactly what this was. He said the only reason they invited him was because they needed him to put me in my place so they could keep leeching off my paycheck. He laughed loudly, calling them all pathetic parasites who could not even afford to buy him a real drink. The humiliation was entirely suffocating. The surrounding tables were beginning to stare at the loud, obnoxious man insulting the well-dressed family. The tuxedo-clad waiter reappeared, asking if they were finally ready to order expensive steaks. Jackson tried to quiet Darnell down, whispering frantically and begging him to just wait a few more minutes for me to arrive. But Darnell was not there to make friends. He was there to dominate, and since I was not there to take the abuse, he happily redirected all of his toxic energy right onto my family. He slammed his hand on the table, causing the water glasses to shake. He told Jackson he was a weak old man who could not even control his own daughters. Every single insult my family had ever hurled at me was now being forcefully shoved right back down their throats by the exact monster they had invited to dinner. They were completely trapped, unable to leave, because they could not pay for the expensive sparkling water they had already consumed, and unable to fight back because they were entirely broken. They sat in the luxurious booth, taking every single piece of verbal abuse Darnell threw at them, praying for a daughter who was never going to walk through those doors. Darnell leaned further across the table, his gold chain swinging like a pendulum as he raised his voice even louder. He pointed a thick finger at Jackson and yelled that the only reason a wealthy family like theirs even tolerated a loser like me was because I was their personal ATM machine. He was practically shouting now, completely disregarding the elegant atmosphere of the steakhouse. He told Connor that he knew all about his fake Wall Street persona, and that a real man would not need to hide behind his wife's credit cards. Connor shrank back into the leather booth, completely terrified of the physically imposing man threatening him. Brielle was weeping openly, ruining her expensive mascara, while Yvonne clutched her pearl necklace, staring in absolute horror at the monster they had unleashed upon themselves. Jackson tried one last time to salvage his pride. He stood up, his face purple with rage and embarrassment, and ordered Darnell to leave the table immediately. Darnell simply laughed, a deep booming sound that echoed off the crystal chandeliers. He slammed his fist on the heavy mahogany table, rattling the empty water glasses, and told Jackson that no one tells him what to do, especially not an old washed-up man who cannot even afford to buy him a steak. He reached across the table and grabbed a silver butter knife, pointing it aggressively toward my father's chest. The surrounding diners gasped, and several people at adjacent tables quickly stood up, pulling their chairs back to get away from the escalating violence. But before Darnell could utter another threat, the heavy oak doors of the restaurant burst open with explosive force. The loud chatter of the dining room was instantly silenced. 4 uniformed Miami police officers stormed into the elegant space, their hands resting heavily on their utility belts. They moved with terrifying speed and precision, cutting straight through the maze of white tablecloths and directly toward the massive circular booth in the center of the room. The hostess trailed behind them, looking completely panicked. The lead officer, a tall, muscular man with a stern expression, pointed directly at Darnell. He barked out Darnell's full legal name and ordered him to drop the silver knife and stand up slowly, with his hands visible. Darnell's arrogant smile vanished instantly. The color drained from his face as he realized what was happening. He dropped the butter knife, which clattered loudly against a porcelain plate. He tried to play it cool, holding his hands up defensively and telling the officers there must be some kind of mistake. He claimed he was just having a friendly dinner with his future in-laws. The lead officer did not even blink. He stepped up to the booth and loudly announced that Darnell was under arrest for 3 active felony warrants out of Miami-Dade County for evasion of child support, totaling $85,000. The words hung in the air, echoing through the silent dining room. The wealthy patrons at the surrounding tables gasped in collective shock. Smartphones instantly appeared from designer purses as dozens of people began recording the chaotic scene. Darnell panicked. He tried to slide out of the booth and push past Connor, attempting to make a run for the kitchen doors. But the officers were too fast. 2 of them grabbed Darnell by his expensive silk shirt, slamming him forcefully face down onto the mahogany dining table. The empty water glasses shattered onto the floor. Brielle screamed, covering her face as shards of glass flew across the leather seat. The sharp metallic click of handcuffs snapping shut around Darnell's wrists echoed clearly over the gasps of the crowd. The lead officer hauled Darnell to his feet, yanking his arms up painfully high behind his back. Darnell struggled, spitting and swearing, calling the officers every foul name he could think of. As they dragged him away from the table, Darnell locked eyes with Jackson. He screamed at my father, accusing him of setting him up. He yelled that this whole dinner was a trap designed by my family to get him arrested. The entire restaurant was now filming my father as a convicted deadbeat dad accused him of orchestrating a police sting operation in the middle of a 5-star steakhouse. The officers dragged Darnell out the front doors, his curses fading into the humid Miami night. The dining room was left in a state of absolute stunned silence. Every single eye in the restaurant was locked onto the circular booth in the center. The maitre d' rushed over looking incredibly angry. He did not ask if they were okay. He demanded that they leave the restaurant immediately for causing a massive public disturbance. Jackson stood frozen, his chest heaving violently as he struggled to process the sheer magnitude of the public humiliation. He clutched his left arm, his face turning a terrifying shade of gray. Yvonne screamed his name, grabbing his shoulders as he swayed unsteadily on his feet. He was not having a full heart attack, but the sheer stress and total destruction of his massive ego had sent him into a severe panic attack. He collapsed back into the leather booth, gasping for air, while the wealthy patrons he so desperately wanted to impress recorded his complete undoing on their phones. Connor, terrified that the police might return to check the financial status of the guests, frantically grabbed Jackson by the arm and hauled him up. He practically dragged my father out of the restaurant, with Yvonne and Brielle trailing behind them, crying hysterically. They stumbled out onto the busy South Beach sidewalk entirely disgraced. They had no money, no car, and their grand plan to humiliate me had just resulted in a violent police raid that was probably already trending on local social media. They had hit rock bottom, but they still had absolutely no idea that I was the one who pushed them off the ledge. The humid night air hung heavy and thick as the four of them trudged back into the dim fluorescent glow of the motel parking lot. The sounds of the nearby highway seemed deafening now, stripped of the comforting buffer of wealth they were so used to. They walked in silence, the only noise coming from the scrape of Connor's expensive leather shoes on the cracked asphalt. When they finally pushed open the flimsy door to their cramped room, the stale smell of bleach hit them again, a harsh reminder of their new reality. Jackson did not sit down. He paced the short distance between the two hard double beds, his hands shaking with a mixture of leftover adrenaline and sheer unadulterated rage. His face was still flushed from the panic attack at the restaurant, and his breathing was shallow, but his ego was demanding a target. He needed someone to blame for the total collapse of his perfect anniversary trip, and since Darnell was currently sitting in a Miami jail cell, that target was me. He snatched his cell phone from his pocket, his fingers trembling as he forcefully punched in my number. He did not care that it was nearing 10 o'clock at night. He did not care about the time difference. He pressed the phone to his ear and waited. Back in Chicago, I was sitting comfortably on the plush white sofa in the grand living room of my newly acquired mansion. The house was completely silent, the only light coming from a single elegant floor lamp and the soft glow of my laptop screen on the coffee table. I had poured myself a generous glass of expensive red wine from what used to be Jackson's private cellar. When my phone began to vibrate on the glass table, illuminating with my father's contact name, I did not immediately answer. I let it ring 3 times, savoring the desperate buzzing sound, before finally swiping the screen to accept the call. I did not say hello. I simply raised the wine glass to my lips and waited. "Where the hell are you?" Jackson screamed into the phone. His voice was so loud and so full of venom that I actually had to pull the receiver a few inches away from my ear. "You were supposed to be on that flight, Tessa. You left us stranded here. You completely humiliated this family. You are a selfish, ungrateful little brat, and when I get my hands on you, I swear to God." He was hyperventilating, practically choking on his own fury. I could hear Yvonne in the background sobbing loudly and Brielle whining about how her entire life was ruined. I took a slow, deliberate sip of the rich red wine, letting the complex flavors settle on my tongue before I finally spoke. My voice was calm, steady, and completely devoid of the fear he was so desperately trying to provoke. "Take a wild guess, Jackson," I replied, my tone dangerously quiet. The use of his first name completely stopped him in his tracks. In 32 years, I had never addressed him by his first name. It was always Dad or Sir. The sudden shift in power dynamics hung heavily across the cellular connection. He stopped pacing in the motel room, the silence stretching out for a long, agonizing moment. "What did you just call me?" he asked, his voice dropping to a dangerous warning growl. "I asked you to take a wild guess," I repeated, leaning back into the soft cushions of the sofa. "But since you are clearly having a difficult night, let me help you out. I am currently sitting in the living room of my house, enjoying a very nice bottle of Cabernet." I paused, letting the words sink in. "How was dinner, by the way? Did Darnell show up? I heard Miami PD is very efficient this time of year." Jackson let out a strange, strangled sound, a mixture of shock and sheer panic. "You," he stammered, his breathing becoming erratic again. "You did this. You set us up. You called the police on him." "I did not set anyone up, Jackson," I said, my voice turning cold and sharp like a scalpel. "I simply provided the authorities with the location of a wanted fugitive. You are the ones who decided to invite a violent, abusive criminal to your anniversary dinner just to break my spirit. You wanted a show, you got a show." Yvonne must have snatched the phone from his hand because suddenly her shrill voice was piercing through the speaker. "Tessa, you listen to me right now," she shrieked. "Your sister is in pieces. Your father nearly had a heart attack, and Connor is completely broke because of some stupid bank error. You need to wire us $10,000 right this second so we can get a real hotel and fix this mess. You owe us this much, you ungrateful child." I set my wine glass down on the coffee table. The absolute audacity of her demands, even when they were sitting in the squalor of their own making, was almost impressive. "I do not owe you a single damn thing, Yvonne," I said. my voice echoing slightly in the large empty room. And Connor is not broke because of a bank error. Connor is broke because he is a criminal running a Ponzi scheme who has been stealing from you for years. The credit cards were flagged for wire fraud because he tried to use stolen funds across state lines. I heard a sharp gasp from Brielle in the background, followed by Connor yelling something defensive that was muffled by the phone. Yvonne stammered, completely caught off guard by the hard facts I was throwing at her. "That is a lie," Yvonne yelled, her voice trembling with denial. "Connor is a successful broker. He takes care of this family. He is a parasite, Yvonne," I interrupted, cutting her off completely. "And speaking of parasites, did the family enjoy the little gift I left behind?" The line went dead silent. "What gift?" Jackson asked, his voice suddenly sounding very old and very weak. "I checked the tracking app earlier," I explained smoothly. "I know you had to check into that rundown motel near the highway. I also know that standard check-in procedures require the front desk to hold any packages delivered for guests. I suggest you go talk to the night manager. He has a very important FedEx envelope waiting for you." Before either of them could say another word, I pressed the red button and ended the call. I placed the phone face down on the glass table and picked up my wine glass again. The hook was set and the line was pulled tight. I could picture them right now frantically rushing out of that filthy room and running toward the motel lobby. They thought the humiliation at the restaurant was the worst part of their night. They had absolutely no idea that the real destruction, the complete and total annihilation of their fake reality, was currently sitting in a brown cardboard envelope waiting for them to tear it open. The run from the motel room to the front lobby was a chaotic blur of panic and desperation. Jackson practically shoved Connor out of the way to get through the door first, with Yvonne and Brielle stumbling closely behind him. They burst into the small, dingy reception area where the night manager, a tired-looking man reading a magazine behind thick bulletproof glass, barely looked up at them. Jackson slammed his hand against the counter. He demanded to know if there was a package delivered for them. His voice was hoarse and frantic, stripping away the last remnants of the wealthy patriarch facade he had desperately clung to for the past decade. The night manager slowly put down his magazine. He turned to a small metal shelf behind him and retrieved a heavy brown FedEx envelope. He slid it through the narrow slot at the bottom of the glass partition. It had my father's name clearly printed on the shipping label. Jackson snatched the envelope, but his hands were shaking so violently that he could not get a grip on the thick cardboard tab. He fumbled with it, tearing at the corners, while Yvonne watched with wide, terrified eyes. Brielle, who was still crying over her ruined mascara, pushed her way to the front. She ripped the envelope out of her father's trembling hands. "Give it to me!" she shrieked. Her acrylic nails tore into the cardboard flap, ripping it open with a loud tearing sound that echoed in the quiet lobby. She pulled out a thick stack of legal documents printed on heavy official paper. Brielle stared at the top page for a long moment. The neon light from the motel sign outside flickered, casting a sickly yellow glow over the paper. Her eyes scanned the bold black text at the top of the document. The air in the small lobby seemed to get sucked entirely out of the room. And then she screamed. It was not a dramatic crying scream. It was a guttural, blood-curdling shriek of absolute horror. She dropped the papers onto the linoleum floor and backed away, as if they had physically burned her. She covered her mouth with both hands, her eyes wide with a terror so profound it silenced everyone else in the room. "Oh my God! What is this?" she shrieked, pointing a trembling finger at the scattered pages. What did she do? Jackson dropped to his knees. The sharp pain in his chest was momentarily forgotten, replaced by a cold, sickening dread that washed over him like ice water. He gathered the papers with shaking hands. Yvonne crouched beside him, pulling the top document into the dim light to read it over his shoulder. The bold black letters at the top of the page spelled out a single devastating word: foreclosure. It was the final notice of default from the private lending firm in Chicago. But it was the second page that truly destroyed them. It was the official transfer of deed. The document clearly outlined that the massive $400,000 second mortgage, The one Connor had secretly taken out to fund his fake investment firm had been entirely bought out. The debt was no longer held by a faceless corporate bank. The debt and the subsequent total ownership of the property was now held by one single individual, me. The name Tessa was printed in stark black ink on the final line, designating me as the sole legal owner of the sprawling brick colonial mansion they prized above all else. The house where they had held their expensive parties, the house where they had mocked my career, the house where they had laughed about sending a violent abuser to destroy my life. It was all legally, undeniably mine. Yvonne let out a low, agonizing moan. She clutched the papers, her knuckles turning white. "This cannot be real," she whispered, her voice cracking. "She cannot do this. This is our house. We built this family in that house." Jackson stared at the document, his eyes entirely hollow. The realization of his complete and total failure crashed down on him. He had mortgaged his entire life away simply to brag about a wealthy son-in-law at the country club. He had handed the keys to his kingdom over to a con artist, and now the daughter he had spent 32 years treating like dirt had bought the kingdom out from under him. The power dynamic had completely inverted in the span of a few horrifying seconds. They were no longer homeowners. They had absolutely no assets. They had no credit cards. They were currently sitting on the floor of a roach-infested motel in South Beach, entirely destitute, while I sat comfortably in the living room of what was now my massive Chicago mansion, drinking expensive wine that used to belong to them. Brielle sank to the floor next to her mother, pulling her knees to her chest. Her expensive designer clothes were stained and wrinkled. She looked up at Connor, who was standing near the door, looking completely pale and terrified. "You," she whispered, pointing a shaking finger at him. "You told us you were making millions. You told Dad to sign those papers because it was a brilliant investment. You said you were going to buy a yacht tomorrow morning." Connor swallowed hard, looking wildly around the small lobby for an exit. He stammered out a weak defense, claiming the market had just taken an unexpected turn and that the foreclosure was just a temporary setback. He said he could fix it if they just gave him a little more time to move some funds around. But Jackson was not listening. He was staring at the third page of the document stack, the page that detailed exactly where the $400,000 had gone. It was a forensic audit report, meticulously compiled and highlighted by me. It showed the direct transfer of funds from the mortgage loan straight into Apex Global Investments, and it showed exactly how that money had been spent. The devastation in the motel lobby was absolute. They were broken financially, emotionally, and legally. But the most destructive piece of information was still waiting for them on the final page of the forensic audit. They thought they had just lost their house, but they were about to realize they had also lost the only thing keeping their fake reality together. The illusion of the golden son-in-law was about to be violently ripped away, and Connor was going to have to answer for every single stolen penny. Jackson's hands were trembling so violently that he dropped the first 2 pages of the document stack onto the dirty motel floor. He clutched the third page, bringing it closer to his face in the dim flickering light of the lobby. It was the executive summary of the forensic audit I had compiled. The bold header at the top of the page read, "Apex Global Investments Forensic Financial Analysis." Underneath that was a detailed bulleted list of transactions that painted a horrifyingly clear picture of Connor's massive financial crimes. Jackson's eyes darted back and forth across the page, reading the numbers in absolute disbelief. The first section detailed the $400,000 second mortgage on the house. It showed the exact date the funds were deposited into Apex Global, and how Connor had immediately transferred 60% of that money into his own personal checking account to pay off his luxury car leases and Brielle designer shopping sprees. But it was the second section of the audit that caused Jackson to stop breathing entirely. It was a breakdown of his own personal retirement accounts, the nest egg he had spent 40 years building up at his corporate job, the money he had proudly entrusted to his golden son-in-law to manage and invest. The audit clearly showed that over the past 2 years, Connor had systematically drained $250,000 from those retirement accounts. There were no investments in high-yield bonds or emerging markets. Connor had simply wired the money directly into his shell company and used it to pay out fake dividends to his earlier Ponzi scheme investors just to keep the entire fraudulent operation afloat. Jackson let out a sound that was half gasp, half sob. He looked up from the paper, his eyes wide and completely hollow. He stared at Connor, who was currently backing slowly toward the glass exit doors of the motel lobby, looking like a cornered rat. "My retirement," Jackson whispered, his voice cracking. "The money I worked my entire life for. You stole it. You stole all of it. Stole all of—" Yvonne scrambled to her feet, snatching the audit report from Jackson's hands. She scanned the numbers, her face turning a sickly shade of gray. She looked at Connor, shaking her head in complete denial. She had spent years holding Connor up as the perfect man, the standard I was supposed to aspire to. She had ridiculed me for being single while praising Brielle for landing such a wealthy provider. Now the undeniable mathematical proof of his absolute worthlessness was staring her right in the face. "Connor, what is this?" Yvonne demanded, her voice shrill and desperate. "Tell me, this is a mistake! Tell me she fabricated these documents just to ruin our trip." "You are a licensed broker. Connor, tell them this is a lie." Connor ran a hand through his perfectly styled hair, which was now messy and damp with nervous sweat. He did not look like a wealthy Wall Street executive anymore. He looked like exactly what he was, a desperate, pathetic criminal who had finally run out of runway. "It is not a lie, Yvonne," he snapped, dropping the polite, respectful tone he usually used with her. "The market was tough. Okay, I had to move some capital around to cover some margins. I was going to pay it back. I just needed a little more time." "You were going to pay it back!" Jackson roared, suddenly finding his voice. His face turned purple with a violent, terrifying rage. "You took a second mortgage out on my house behind my back. You forged my signature, you stole my retirement fund to buy your stupid watches, and you were planning to steal $50,000 from Tessa this morning. You are a thief." Jackson lunged forward, grabbing Connor by the collar of his expensive dress shirt. The sudden violence shocked everyone in the small lobby. The night manager behind the bulletproof glass finally looked up from his magazine, reaching slowly for the phone on his desk. Jackson slammed Connor back against the glass entrance doors, pinning him there. The older man was fueled by pure adrenaline and the absolute destruction of his pride. "You ruined me!" Jackson screamed, spitting in Connor's face. "You took everything I built. I trusted you. I let you marry my daughter. I treated you like a son while you were bleeding me dry." Connor struggled, trying to push the older man off him. "Get your hands off me, old man!" Connor yelled, shoving Jackson hard in the chest. Jackson stumbled backward, tripping over Brielle's expensive luggage and crashing hard onto the linoleum floor. Yvonne screamed, rushing to her husband's side, while Brielle simply stood there, completely paralyzed by the escalating violence. Connor straightened his ruined shirt, his chest heaving. He looked down at my parents writhing on the dirty floor of a cheap motel, and the thin veneer of his fake personality completely shattered. The polite, charming son-in-law completely disappeared, replaced by a vicious, arrogant con artist who realized he had absolutely nothing left to lose. He looked at the family he had systematically destroyed, and he let out a cold, cruel laugh. Connor straightened his ruined, expensive shirt, his chest heaving as he looked down at my parents on the dirty motel floor. The polite, charming son-in-law completely disappeared. The mask of the wealthy, successful white broker cracked and fell away, revealing the vicious, arrogant con artist underneath. He looked at the family he had systematically destroyed and let out a cold, cruel laugh. But before Connor could speak, Brielle let out another gasp. She had reached into the brown FedEx envelope and pulled out the final piece of evidence I had included in the package. It was not a financial document. It was a glossy 8x10 photograph. Brielle stared at the picture, her hands shaking so badly she almost dropped it. It was a crystal-clear image of Connor sitting at a high-end rooftop bar in downtown Chicago. He was not alone. He had his arm wrapped tightly around a young blonde woman who was wearing an expensive diamond necklace. The exact same diamond necklace Connor had told Brielle he bought for his mother. There were more photos in the stack. Photos of Connor and the blonde woman walking into a luxury apartment building. Photos of them kissing in the front seat of his leased Lamborghini. Brielle whispered, her voice cracking. "Who is this?" Connor did not even look at the photos. He rolled his eyes, letting out a loud, exasperated sigh. He crossed his arms over his chest, looking at Brielle not with guilt or remorse, but with absolute, unfiltered disgust. "Oh, grow up, Brielle." He snapped, his voice entirely devoid of the fake affection he usually used with her. "You really thought I was going to spend the rest of my life playing house with you? You are a spoiled, demanding child who cares more about Instagram likes than actual reality. You were a convenient prop for my business. Nothing more." Brielle's face crumpled. She dropped the photos onto the floor, stepping back as if he had physically struck her. Yvonne scrambled to her feet, rushing to her daughter's side. She wrapped her arms around Brielle, glaring at Connor with pure hatred. "How dare you speak to her that way?" Yvonne shrieked. "You are a monster! You used us! You used my daughter!" Connor let out a sharp, barking laugh that echoed in the small motel lobby. The night manager behind the glass partition picked up his phone, dialing a number, but Connor did not care. He was entirely unleashed. "Used you?" He repeated, his voice dripping with condescension. "I used you." "Please, Yvonne. You people were begging to be used. You were so desperate to look rich, so desperate to have a successful white son-in-law to parade around your stupid country club that you never even bothered to ask a single real question about my business. You just handed over your money and your house because you wanted the status." Jackson struggled to his feet, leaning heavily against the wall for support. His chest was still tight, but the shock of Connor's words temporarily overrode his physical pain. "You racist piece of trash." Jackson wheezed, his voice weak but full of venom. "I treated you like a son." Connor took a step toward my father, towering over the older man. He pointed a finger directly in Jackson's face, his expression twisting into an ugly sneer. "Do not ever call me your son." Connor spat, his voice low and dangerous. "You are a pathetic, weak old man who could not even provide for his own family without relying on the daughter you treat like absolute garbage. You think I wanted to be part of this family. You think I actually enjoyed sitting at your dinner table listening to you brag about your mediocre life. The only smart person in your entire genetic line is Tessa, and you were too busy kissing my ass to realize she was the one actually keeping the lights on." The truth hit them harder than any physical blow. To hear the man they idolized openly state that the daughter they despised was the only one with any actual intelligence or worth completely shattered their fragile reality. Connor did not stop there. He turned back to Brielle, who was sobbing uncontrollably against our mother's shoulder. He looked her up and down with an expression of pure contempt. "And you," he said, shaking his head, "you are going to end up exactly like your parents. Broke, pathetic, and living in a fantasy world. I am filing for Chapter 7 personal bankruptcy on Monday. That is right. I am wiping my slate completely clean. All the credit card debt, all the personal loans, all the lease agreements, they are all in my name under my shell companies. The bankruptcy court will discharge the debt, and the banks will come looking for the assets." He smiled a cold, terrifying smile. "And since you all happily signed over your house and your retirement funds to those shell companies, the federal government is going to seize whatever is left. You have absolutely nothing." Connor quickly bent down and snatched the 3 crumpled $100 bills that Jackson had dropped on the floor during the scuffle. It was the absolute last bit of cash the family had to their name. "Hey!" Jackson yelled, stepping forward, but Connor shoved him back against the wall with alarming force. "Consider this my severance package," Connor said, shoving the cash into his pocket. He turned toward the glass exit doors, not looking back, even once. "Enjoy the roaches," he called out over his shoulder. He pushed through the heavy doors and walked out into the humid Miami night, disappearing down the cracked sidewalk toward the busy highway. The heavy glass doors swung shut behind him, leaving a suffocating silence in their wake. Jackson, Yvonne, and Brielle were left standing in the dingy motel lobby entirely alone. They had no money. They had no credit cards. They had no house to return to. Their grand plan to humiliate me and force me to submit to an abuser had resulted in their own absolute and total destruction. They were stranded 1,000 miles from home, stripped of their pride, their wealth, and their fake golden son-in-law. They were finally forced to face the horrifying reality of exactly who they were and exactly what they had done. The silence in the motel lobby was suffocating, pressing in on them from all sides. The neon sign outside continued to buzz a harsh electrical hum that seemed to amplify their total isolation. Yvonne was the first to move. She slowly let go of Brielle, stepping away from her daughter's trembling body. She looked around the dingy space, her eyes wide and unseeing. The reality of their situation was finally sinking in, entirely bypassing her usual defensive mechanisms. She had spent her entire life manipulating everyone around her, ensuring she was always comfortable, always catered to, always superior. And now she was standing in the middle of nowhere with absolutely nothing. Jackson remained slumped against the wall, his breathing shallow. He looked older than he ever had, his face deeply lined with exhaustion and absolute defeat. He slowly reached into his pocket and pulled out his cell phone. His hands were shaking so badly he nearly dropped it. He stared at the screen for a long time, the glowing light illuminating the deep shadows under his eyes. He found my name in his contacts and pressed call. Back in Chicago, I was still sitting on the sofa, my wineglass half empty. I watched the phone light up again. I let it ring twice before I answered. This time, I did not speak. I just listened. Tessa Jackson whispered, his voice completely devoid of the booming, arrogant patriarch tone he had used just 10 minutes earlier. It was the voice of a broken, terrified old man. I did not reply. He took a shaky breath. "Tessa, please," he begged. "Connor is gone. He took the cash. We have nothing. We cannot pay for the room. We cannot get a flight home. Please, you have to help us. I am your father." The desperation in his voice was palpable. It was the kind of plea that would have instantly shattered the old me. The old me would have immediately transferred funds, booked them a first-class flight home, and apologized for upsetting them. The old me would have set myself on fire just to keep them warm. But I was not that woman anymore. I took another slow sip of my wine, the rich flavor grounding me in the present moment. "You are not my father, Jackson," I said, my voice perfectly calm, level, and cold. "You are simply the man who contributed half the genetics required for my existence." "Tessa, do not do this," Yvonne shrieked from the background, her voice hysterical. "You cannot leave us here. We are your family." "Family?" I repeated the word, tasting sour on my tongue. "Let us talk about family, Yvonne. Family is supposed to protect you. Family is supposed to build you up. But for 32 years you have done nothing but tear me down to make yourselves feel taller." I stood up from the sofa, walking slowly over to the massive floor-to-ceiling windows that looked out over the sprawling, manicured lawn of the estate. "Do you remember when I graduated top of my class in college?" I asked, my voice echoing softly in the large room. "You did not even come to the ceremony because Brielle had a minor cold and needed you to make her soup. Do you remember when I got my first major promotion at the firm? You told me it was a shame I had to work so hard because I was not pretty enough to marry rich like Brielle." I heard Yvonne let out a soft, choking sob over the phone, but I did not stop. "Do you remember the day I finally left Darnell?" I asked, the memory causing a brief flash of cold anger to spike in my chest. "I came to this house with bruised ribs and a black eye, completely broken and terrified. And what did you say, Yvonne? You told me I must have provoked him. You told me I was too difficult to love and that I should just go back and apologize." "Tessa, we are sorry," Jackson pleaded, his voice cracking completely. "We were wrong. We see that now. Please just send us enough for a flight. We will pay you back. We swear." "Pay me back with what, Jackson?" I asked, a cold laugh escaping my lips. "You have no money. You have no retirement. You have no house. The only asset you had left was your fake pride, and Connor just took that too. I turned away from the window, walking back toward the center of the living room. You did not call me to apologize because you suddenly realized you were terrible parents. I said the truth, ringing clear and absolute in the quiet room. You called me to apologize because you have finally run out of money. You are only sorry because you are suffering the exact consequences of your own actions. Tessa. Please, Brielle voice joined the chorus of despair, sounding small and pathetic. I am scared. You should be, Brielle, I replied, entirely unsympathetic. You have spent your entire life pretending to be something you are not. You built an entire identity on stolen money and fake status. Now you have to figure out how to survive in the real world like everyone else. I suggest you start looking for a minimum wage job. Tessa, you cannot just abandon us, Jackson cried, his voice rising in panic. Watch me, I said, my voice dropping to a final definitive whisper. I did not wait for the response. I pulled the phone away from my ear and pressed the red button disconnecting the call. I immediately opened my phone settings and navigated to my contact list. I found Jackson's name and hit block caller. I did the same for Yvonne, and then I did the same for Brielle. I set the phone down on the glass coffee table. The absolute finality of the action settled over me like a heavy, warm blanket. The invisible tether that had kept me bound to their toxic orbit for over 3 decades was finally completely severed. They could scream, they could cry, they could beg the universe for mercy, but none of those sounds would ever reach my ears again. They were entirely cut off, stranded in the miserable reality they had created for themselves, and I was finally entirely free. I picked up my wine glass and walked out of the living room, turning off the lights behind me. The house was quiet, safe, and perfectly mine. The morning sun rose over the cheap motel, bringing absolutely no warmth to the cold reality of their situation. At exactly 11 o'clock, the gruff motel manager banged loudly on their flimsy wooden door, informing them that checkout time had passed and they needed to leave the premises immediately. They had no money to extend their stay, and my blocked number meant they had no one to bail them out. Jackson, Yvonne, and Brielle were forced to gather their things and drag their massive, heavy designer suitcases out into the sweltering Florida humidity. They walked for over 2 miles along the cracked pavement of the busy highway, the wheels of their expensive luggage grinding harshly against the gravel and loose trash. They finally found a dingy pawn shop sandwiched between a liquor store and a laundromat. Jackson, who just 48 hours ago was sipping complimentary champagne in a first-class airline seat, had to endure the ultimate humiliation of sliding his heavy gold Rolex watch across a scratched glass counter. The pawnshop owner took one look at the desperate old man sweating in his wrinkled golf polo and offered him a tiny fraction of what the watch was actually worth. Jackson tried to argue. He tried to puff out his chest and use his booming patriarch voice to demand respect, but the owner just stared at him blankly and told him to take the cash or leave the store. Jackson took the cash. It was barely enough to purchase 3 one-way tickets on a Greyhound bus back to Chicago. When they arrived at the bus terminal, the stark contrast to their usual luxury travel was physically jarring. The waiting area was crowded, noisy, and smelled strongly of stale sweat and cheap fast food. Brielle sat on her monogrammed suitcase, pulling her designer jacket tightly around her shoulders, trying to hide her face from the strangers around her. She kept frantically checking her phone, hoping for a miracle, but her battery was slowly dying, and she had no portable charger to revive her fake digital life. Yvonne sat next to her, staring blankly at the stained linoleum floor, her manicured hands trembling endlessly in her lap. When their bus was finally called, they had to wait in a long, disorganized line, pushing their way toward the vehicle. The bus driver did not care about their expensive bags, throwing the heavy leather luggage roughly into the storage compartment under the bus, alongside cardboard boxes and duffel bags. They climbed the narrow rubber steps into the cabin and were immediately hit with the smell of industrial cleaner and stale air. The bus was completely packed. They could not even sit together. Jackson squeezed his large frame into a tiny window seat next to a man who fell asleep, and snored loudly against his shoulder. Yvonne was wedged near the back, next to the bathroom door, which slammed open and shut violently every few minutes. Brielle was trapped in the middle of the bus, surrounded by crying children and people talking loudly on their phones. The journey took 48 agonizing hours. As the heavy bus rolled slowly through the endless highways of Florida, Georgia, and Tennessee, the deep physical and emotional toll began to completely break them down. They had only saved $20 for food, which meant they had to survive on stale vending machine crackers and warm bottled water purchased at dingy highway rest stops. Their stomachs rumbled loudly, their bodies aching from sitting in rigid upright positions for hours on end. There was no extra legroom, there were no hot towels, and there was absolutely no escaping each other. By the time the sun set on the first day, the polite facade they had maintained as a wealthy family completely shattered. The sheer exhaustion and the gnawing hunger stripped away the last remaining layers of their arrogance, exposing the raw, bitter resentment they had been hiding for years. During a brief 15-minute rest stop outside of Atlanta, they stood in the freezing parking lot, shivering in their thin resort clothes, and began viciously tearing each other apart. Jackson blamed Yvonne for raising such a weak, entitled daughter. He pointed a shaking finger at Brielle and yelled that if she had actually gotten a real job instead of posting stupid pictures on the internet, they would not be in this mess. He said Connor saw exactly how desperate they were for status and played them all for absolute fools. Yvonne screamed right back at him, her voice hoarse and raw. She blamed Jackson for his massive ego, saying he was the one who signed the mortgage papers without even reading them just because he wanted to feel like a big, wealthy investor. She told him he was a complete failure as a provider and a pathetic failure as a husband. Brielle, who had spent her entire life being coddled and protected, finally snapped. She screamed at both of them, her voice echoing across the dark, empty parking lot. She told them they were the ones who taught her that money and appearances were the only things that mattered in the world. She said they raised her to be useless and dependent, and now they were punishing her for being exactly what they created. She looked at her mother and her father with pure, unadulterated hatred and said she wished she had never been born into their family. They boarded the bus again in heavy, suffocating silence, refusing to even look at one another for the remainder of the trip. The second night was even worse than the first. The temperature on the bus dropped significantly, and they had no blankets to keep warm. They shivered in the dark, listening to the heavy hum of the engine and the sound of the massive tires rolling endlessly against the asphalt. Their expensive clothes were deeply stained and wrinkled. Their hair was matted and unwashed, and their faces were hollow and drawn. They had lost absolutely everything. They had lost their wealth, they had lost their home, and they had lost the golden son-in-law they had worshipped. But worst of all, they had lost the comforting illusion of their own superiority. They were forced to sit with their own toxic thoughts for 2 straight days, unable to escape the horrifying realization that their entire lives were a complete and total lie. They had spent decades abusing me, using my money to build a fake castle of arrogance, and now they were trapped under the heavy rubble of its collapse. On the morning of the third day, the bus finally crossed the Illinois state line. The familiar skyline of Chicago appeared in the distance, gray and unforgiving under a heavy blanket of winter clouds. The bus pulled into the downtown terminal, the air brakes hissing loudly as it came to a complete stop. They dragged themselves out of their cramped seats, their bodies stiff and aching, their spirits entirely crushed. They retrieved their battered designer luggage from the undercarriage and stood on the cold, windy sidewalk of the city they used to believe they owned. They had finally made it back home, but they were about to discover that the absolute worst part of their punishment was still waiting for them at the front gate. The taxi ride from the downtown terminal to the affluent northern suburbs took 45 minutes. It cost them the absolute last bit of cash Jackson had managed to hoard from the pawn shop. They sat in the back of the cab, smelling of stale bus air and 2 days of unwashed anxiety, staring out the windows as the familiar manicured lawns of their neighborhood came into view. They were clinging to the desperate hope that the foreclosure notice was just a threat, a legal maneuver that could be undone once Jackson made a few phone calls. They just wanted to get inside and pretend the nightmare in Miami had never happened. But as the taxi turned onto their quiet tree-lined street, the remaining shreds of their hope were violently ripped away. The cab rolled to a stop at the end of their wide circular driveway, and Jackson let out a sharp gasp. The sprawling brick colonial mansion was still there, but it was completely inaccessible. A brand new heavy wrought iron security fence had been erected across the entire front perimeter of the property, stretching all the way into the thick hedges on either side. The heavy iron gates were chained and locked with a massive steel padlock. Parked directly in front of the driveway blocking any possible entry was a white and green Cook County Sheriff cruiser. A uniformed deputy was leaning against the hood of the vehicle, holding a clipboard, looking incredibly bored. They spilled out of the taxi, dragging their battered designer luggage behind them. Jackson stumbled toward the gate, his chest heaving with exhaustion and renewed panic. He yelled at the deputy, demanding to know what was going on and ordering him to move his vehicle off his private property. The deputy did not flinch. He stood up straight, resting his hand casually on his utility belt. He asked Jackson for his name, and when Jackson yelled it, the deputy simply nodded. He informed them that the property had legally changed ownership due to a finalized foreclosure buyout. The deputy stated in a flat, professional tone that Jackson, Yvonne, and Brielle were no longer authorized to be on the premises and that any attempt to breach the iron gate would result in immediate arrest for criminal trespassing. Yvonne began to hyperventilate, clutching the iron bars of the gate with her shaking, manicured hands. She screamed that there had to be a mistake, that they had lived in this house for over 20 years, and that the police could not just lock them out on the street. That is when the heavy oak front door of the mansion slowly opened. I stepped out onto the wide stone porch holding a hot cup of coffee in one hand. I was wearing a soft cashmere sweater and comfortable leggings, looking entirely rested and completely at peace. The three of them froze, pressing their faces against the iron bars, like prisoners staring out of a cage. I took a slow sip of my coffee, letting the quiet morning air settle between us, before I turned back into the house for a brief moment. When I reappeared, I was dragging 3 large black plastic trash bags behind me. I walked slowly down the long, paved driveway, the sound of the plastic scraping against the concrete echoing loudly in the silent neighborhood. I stopped just a few feet shy of the iron gate, looking at the ruined, exhausted faces of the family that had spent my entire life trying to destroy me. I did not say a word. I simply hoisted the first heavy black bag and tossed it completely over the tall iron fence. It landed with a dull thud on the sidewalk at Jackson's feet. I threw the second bag over for Brielle and then the third bag for Yvonne. "What is this?" Jackson demanded, staring at the black plastic bags like they were toxic waste. "Those are your personal belongings," I said, my voice calm and perfectly even. I had my attorney review the foreclosure and asset seizure laws. Everything inside that house that was purchased using stolen money from Apex Global Investments belongs to the estate to help cover the massive debt Connor left behind. That includes your expensive furniture, your jewelry, your electronics, and Brielle's entire designer wardrobe. The only things you legally own are your cheap cotton pajamas, your old gym shoes, and your basic toiletries. I bagged them up for you as a courtesy so you would not have to walk away completely empty-handed. Brielle let out a loud, agonizing wail, dropping to her knees on the cold, concrete sidewalk. She tore open her trash bag, finding only faded sweatpants and worn-out t-shirts. Her thousands of dollars in designer handbags and custom shoes were locked inside my house, legally seized to pay for her husband's massive financial crimes. She sobbed uncontrollably, realizing her fake Instagram life was permanently over. Yvonne could not take it anymore. She gripped the iron bars, her knuckles white, and began weeping hysterically. She looked at me with wild, desperate eyes and tried to play the only card she had left. "Tessa, how can you do this to us?" she shrieked, tears streaming down her hollow face. "I am your mother. I carried you. I gave birth to you. You came from my body. You cannot treat your own flesh and blood like this." We made mistakes, but we are family. You have to let us in, Tessa. Please, you have to forgive us. I stood on the safe side of the iron gate looking at the woman who had spent 3 decades making me feel entirely worthless. The old me would have let the word mother bypass my logical brain and manipulate my heart. But the woman standing in the driveway had been completely cured of that disease. Being a mother is a verb, Yvonne, I said, my voice carrying clearly over her desperate sobbing. It is an action. It means protecting your child. It means nurturing them and keeping them safe from harm. You never did any of those things. You used my existence to fund your lifestyle, and you used my trauma as a weapon to keep me in line. You laughed when Connor plotted to steal $50,000 from me. You smiled when he planned to ambush me with Darnell. You did not care if I survived as long as your bills were paid. Yvonne choked on her tears, shaking her head frantically in denial, but I raised my hand, stopping her. You want to talk about family? I continued, my tone shifting from cold to absolute legal authority. Let us talk about the law. The law says this property is mine. The law says Connor is a federal criminal who embezzled $250,000 from Jackson's retirement. The law says you signed fraudulent mortgage documents. Your emotional manipulation does not work anymore, Yvonne, because it has no legal standing. The sheriff is standing right there to enforce the boundaries you refused to respect for 32 years. I took one step backward, signaling that the conversation was entirely over. Take your trash bags and leave my property, I said, turning my back on them. If you ever contact me again, I will have Julian file a permanent restraining order, and I will hand over the audio recording of the patio conversation to the FBI to prove you were complicit in Connor's wire fraud. I walked back up the driveway, my head held high completely, ignoring the frantic screams and the heavy sobbing echoing from the street. I stepped inside my beautiful, quiet mansion and locked the heavy oak door. The aftermath of that morning was swift and entirely merciless. Connor thought he was a criminal mastermind when he walked away from my family in Miami, leaving them completely destitute while he slipped into the night with a few $100s. He assumed he could just disappear into the humid Florida wind and start a brand new grift somewhere else, relying on his charming smile and his tailored suits. He made it exactly as far as the international departure terminal at Miami Airport. When he approached the ticketing counter to purchase a one-way flight to Costa Rica using a hidden offshore account number, he was immediately flagged by federal authorities. My attorney, Julian, had handed over the complete forensic audit, the bank ledgers, and the audio recording to the FBI days prior. They had been tracking his digital footprint the entire time, watching every desperate move he made. 2 federal agents in dark windbreakers apprehended Connor right at the counter. The arrogance completely drained from his face as he was aggressively handcuffed and publicly dragged through the crowded terminal, crying and begging for a lawyer while travelers recorded his humiliation on their phones. He was indicted on multiple counts of federal wire fraud and embezzlement. He is currently serving a 10-year sentence in a medium-security federal penitentiary, where his fake Wall Street persona means absolutely nothing. Without Connor to fund their fake reality, and without me to serve as their emotional punching bag, an endless bank account. Jackson and Yvonne completely collapsed. They had absolutely no assets to their names and no rich friends willing to save them. The bankruptcy court seized whatever minimal savings they had tried to hide to pay back the victims of the Ponzi scheme. They were forced to move into a tiny, run-down one-bedroom apartment in a gritty industrial neighborhood on the far south side of Chicago. The walls of their new home are paper-thin. The plumbing constantly leaks, and the wealthy country club friends they spent decades trying to impress completely abandoned them the moment the money dried up. Jackson spends his days sitting in a cheap folding chair, staring blankly at a small television, mourning the massive ego he can no longer afford to feed. Yvonne sits by a dirty window, bitterly complaining to anyone who will listen about how cruelly life has treated her entirely, refusing to take accountability for her own monstrous actions. But the most poetic justice was reserved for my former golden sister, Brielle. With absolutely no college degree, no marketable skills, and her fake internet reputation entirely destroyed by the public scandal, she was forced to face the harsh, horrifying reality of actual hard work. She now works 40 hours a week, wearing a greasy polyester uniform and a plastic name tag at a local fast food drive-thru. The girl who once demanded penthouse suites and luxury sports cars on my dime now spends her days smelling of old frying oil and asking impatient customers if they want to upsize their French fries. She takes the public bus to work every single morning, staring out the window at a world she used to pretend she owned. As for me, I am no longer standing behind an iron gate protecting my peace. I am actively living it out loud. Right now, I am sitting on the polished teak deck of a massive luxury yacht gently swaying in the crystal-clear turquoise waters of the Caribbean. The afternoon sun is warm on my skin, and the salty ocean breeze carries the sound of genuine, relaxed laughter. I did not have to steal or manipulate or forge signatures to get here. I earned every single inch of this beautiful deck through my own hard work, my relentless dedication, and my brilliant mind. I am surrounded by my true chosen family. Julian, my attorney who became one of my fiercest friends, is sitting across from me pouring expensive vintage champagne into crystal flutes. My colleagues and real friends, people who love me for exactly who I am and not what I can buy them, are lounging in the sun sharing stories and building real memories. There is no anxiety here. There is no fear of an impending ambush or a cruel insult disguised as a joke. There is only profound, undeniable peace. Society constantly tells us that blood is thicker than water. They tell us that family is everything, and that we must endlessly forgive the people who share our genetics, no matter how deeply they cut us or how often they betray us. They try to guilt us into staying in toxic dynamics because of a biological accident. But I am here to tell you that loyalty to a toxic bloodline is nothing more than a slow, agonizing suicide. If the people who are supposed to love you and protect you are the ones secretly handing your abusers the knife, you have absolutely no obligation to stand there and bleed for them. Cutting off my toxic family was the hardest and most terrifying thing I ever had to do, but it was the absolute only way to save my own life. I poured the heavy concrete foundation of my success directly over the ashes of their manipulation. If you are listening to this right now and you are suffocating under the weight of a family that treats you like an option, a scapegoat, or a personal ATM machine, I want you to know that you possess the ultimate power to walk away. You do not have to accept their abuse just because you share a last name. Lock the door, change the locks, and build a life so beautiful and so secure that they will never even be allowed to look at it. Thank you so much for listening to my story today. If you found strength or inspiration in this journey, please hit the like button, leave a comment below, and subscribe to the channel for more authentic stories of survival, boundaries, and sweet revenge. Remember, your peace is your most valuable asset. Do not ever let anyone steal it from you.